Hello. This is a Horror Obsessive original story. Patient 209 is our longest work by far, triple the length of our previous tale. Patient 209 is a combination of two fantastic subgenres. Journal horror, meaning that the story is delivered through the personal journal entries of our protagonist after the fact, and cosmic horror in the style of H.P. Lovecraft. Both genres, but especially the Lovecraftian side, are notorious for being slow burns. And Patient 209 is no exception. The quote, real story doesn't begin until about halfway through, but don't let that stop you. Let the story lull you into normalcy before taking its unnerving twists and turns. If you like Lovecraft, you'll like this. So, get ready for the indescribable and the building inner madness of a Lovecraftian tale about an insane asylum and its most peculiar occupant. Thank you for your continued support of Horror Obsessive, and please enjoy Patient 209.
Patient 209. Written and read by Ian Schoen. The following has been excerpted from the personal journal of Respite Sanitarium Patient 973, Theodore Murdoch, on October 17th, 1955. File has been seized from Chief Examiner Landis by the state of Maine after Surgeon General Collins recommended it be collected for further evaluation. The patient's current whereabouts are unknown. Sunday, June 5th. Weather, sunny. Of all the places to find myself on my first serious deployment, Respite Sanitarium will not treat me kindly, my body nor my mind. Chief Examiner Landis says we should be keeping a journal of our tour here, says it will help keep us grounded without the ability to write home. The aged Marine must think we're still in the trenches in France. I suppose it is similar, psychologically speaking. We're on a rock somewhere horribly forlorn off the coast of Maine, surrounded by lunatics. Fortunately, I've already begun to mingle with the other staff. I found a man unaccompanied in the cafeteria, and he challenged me to a duel of wits in the way of cards. Reginald Waters and I made an instinctual connection, and it's good to know I have a friend here. He works down in maintenance, one of the fellows keeping the kitchen and toilets together so we don't have to. The sharpness of his wit, despite his lack of scientific training, makes for quite the refreshing appeal. University and all its stodginess made me long for the common man. Though I fear nothing is common about the inmates. From here in my room I can already hear a low drone of maniacal laughter and pounding against bars. They say respite gets the worst of them. I hope for my own sanity that they're wrong. Monday, June 6th. Weather, windy. The vistas of this desolate rock weigh heavily on my mind's eye tonight. It bears stark contrast with the sweet plains of home, here where the rocks jut out from the frothing ocean for miles around. I was given a tour of the facilities today by Dr. Lawrence, the man I am to primarily assist. In the afternoon, the doctor presented me before a few of his patients. We met them out on the green today. Reginald, my friend from yesterday, greeted me fondly from his hedge trimming. It's nice to know that not everyone here is as deranged as the inmates. Dr. Lawrence led me over to his group, a trio of misfits playing cards by a bird feeder. One was an old bat, her curls of blue hair stacked in untamed rows atop her mole-ridden face. Across from her was another, a skinny woman with scratch marks on her arms, most likely self-inflicted. Between them sat an elderly gentleman, a scowl decorating his well-creased face as he set down cards absent-mindedly. The thin woman laid down her hand on top of his pile of cards and squealed with glee. "I won!" she said. "No, you didn't!" raged the hag. "There's nothing in that hand. Now pick it up and play. I'm going for gin." "Ladies," Dr. Lawrence interjected, his gentle voice cutting through the shrill cries, "I have a new friend for you. Would you like to meet him?" I stood observing, my arms crossed behind my back, my face complacent. "Don't need any new friends," the man muttered bitterly, averting the doctor's gaze by fixating on some grass blades. "Now, Eustace, that's no way to make him feel welcome." The doctor smiled warmly, his eyes half open in a comforting face of bedside manner. "Yeah, Eustace," the thin woman shouted at him despite being only a foot away. "You must be scared." She had a shrill laugh. The man glowered at her. "Shut up, Shirley." Yeah, shut up, Shirley, the hag cut in, her cards dropping carelessly from her gnarly talons. Shut up, shut up, shut up! The woman called Shirley threw her cards at the hag. Don't take sides, Margaret. You just want to run him behind the woodshed. Shirley laughed as Margaret jabbed her fingers. Eustace just scanned the dirt around his feet, muttering to himself. The trio flung the deck of cards at each other. The calm that had settled as we approached clearly shattered. Dr. Lawrence stepped closer to the group, speaking in a hushed voice in an attempt to draw their attention. He motioned to a nearby attendant, the gentleman in all white grabbing a few of his associates and heading our way. Don't mind them. They're quite mad, you see. It took a moment for my mind to absorb another voice speaking in this mess of strangers, and another moment to understand that it was speaking to me. I turned towards the speaker. Seated at another cloth-covered table sat a gentleman, pale in complexion, who could be no more than mid-20s in age. His hair was well kept, brown to match his eyes, and while he wore the typical gray uniform of the inmates, in his eyes I saw a distinct sense. I don't know how else to describe it, only that it held awareness, that this man held enough sense to compensate for all the lunatics of respite. He smiled gently, looking up from his crossword. You're shaking like a leaf. Are you quite all right? My complexion, I must admit, had fallen during the catastrophic introduction to the elderly trio, my false smile being born only by sheer will alone, though it seems this man had seen past that directly into my paled spirit. My eyes darted to the trio, then back to the man. You must forgive them, the man gestured with his pen to the group. They're not malicious. Shirley lost her husband during the war. Got so batty at the news she strangled her cats. Was going after the neighbor's dog when they called her in. The violence has come a long way, but she's more on the side of delirium nowadays. Eustace lived on a farm in Idaho. He claims the place was haunted, first by good ghosts, then by wicked spirits. Says they used him for terrible things. Won't say what. Margaret worked the radio room 8 to 8 every day for 4 years. Something akin to sandpaper of the soul, the way her spirit has been worn down to nothing. He smirked a little. Apparently she lusts heavily, although the guards would never allow her to fulfill those wishes. I looked at each of the trio with a new concern, the 3 attendants calming them down from their individual spasms. Dr. Lawrence squatted near Shirley, whose shrill barking showered him in a ray of saliva. Every movement, from Eustace's shudders to Margaret's vacant, glazed expression, carried more weight. The heft of their humanity sits with me, even now, hours later. Do you have a name, stranger? I was startled again, the voice breaking my concentration. The man was looking at me, full and attentive. I stammer out my name, and he smiles. It is a pleasure, Theodore. I hope first impressions are not condemning. With time, I believe you may come to like respite. The man leaned in a bit across the table and whispered slyly. At least it's good to know somebody still has their wits about them here. He chuckled slightly before going back to his crossword. Dr. Lawrence stood, straightening his coat, dropping his smile. Now that you've calmed down a bit, I think it's time we met that friend I mentioned. He is my new assistant, so I want you to speak kindly to him. The doctor beckoned me forward. I approach and introduce myself. Each of the trio has an attendant behind them, at least one hand on each of the inmates' shoulders, their immaculately white uniforms obtuse against the gray-robed lunatics. As I say how much I'm looking forward to working with them, I inspect each of their gazes. Shirley and Eustace don't make eye contact, the former too twitchy and the latter too intent on inspecting a clump of dirt. Margaret met my gaze, but there's no telling how much permeated her vacant stare. Once I've finished, I nod to the doctor and step back. Now, friends, was that so hard? He said. Eustace mumbled something, but before we could disrupt the peace further, the doctor nodded to the assistants, and the 5 of us left. Behind me, I heard the sound of shuffling playing cards. Walking out of the green, Dr. Lawrence whispered to me his dismay regarding their behavior today. Reginald gave me an expression in passing, one of sympathy and fear for my well-being. The doctor and I stopped by the hedges. The old salt gave me directions towards various departments I'll need to be running paperwork from and where I can meet some of the less serious patients. The imposing parapets of the Gothic structure cast heavy shadows as they stretched towards the sea. Before he left, I asked one question of Dr. Lawrence. I gesture over to the gentleman doing the crossword. Who is that man? The doctor followed my gaze and smiled slightly. Oh, him? That's patient 209. Pay him no mind. Thursday, June 9th. Weather, sunny. Dr. Lawrence gave me the day off from patients today to help with the file room. The 2 primary bookkeepers kept me on my feet for most of the hours I was there. It was well lit, at least, with dozens of towering shelves like the most fancy of libraries back home. Each cabinet was stacked to the brim, storing every file and piece of daily reported paperwork from all the current inmates, more than 200 altogether, I believe, and similar records kept from every patient treated over the last 20 years. When the daily work had died down, they gave me full leave to look around. Dr. Lawrence recommended that I take a look at his patients, I suppose they are my patients as well, and memorize as much as I could. The gentleman bookkeeper offered to type copies, but I have always been a quick study. It was around the time when I was looking over Eustace's file, age 62, eye color brown, when a curious thought dawned on me. Leaving my work for the time, I began working my way down the prisoner filing system. Each patient at respite is given a number, mostly for filing purposes in the very room I was in. Currently, we operate on numbers somewhere between 840 and through the 900s, the bookkeepers calling them out with glee as they neared the end of the day's paperwork. I took a stroll down the large shelves, scanning the numbers on the files, hoping to find some answers to the many questions Dr. Lawrence had given me. Despite his advice, I had given patient 209 quite a considerable amount of my mind. The fact that he did not have a name was one thing. Did not probably is not the right wording for it, and yet when Dr. Lawrence had addressed him, it was through numeral, unlike every other patient. The fact that he seems to have special permissions is another. He annotates books and other such stationary activities on the green every day. In the guide for patients, it clearly states that the use of a ballpoint pen would be greatly outside of his permissions. Is it simply because his seniority has earned him special privilege? And yet he speaks with clarity. How can such a man still be retained after all this time? One conversation has raised so many questions. After walking down the aisles and many rows of stacked high cabinets and boxes, I located the 200s. I thumbed my way to the expected location. I walked past 210, expecting to find 209 right above it. But lo and behold, 208 sat above 210. It is not as though 209 was taken away from its rightful place. It is as if records for him were never added in the first place. More mysteries. My mind raced. I had another thought and hastened back through the shelves. I went past the earliest known active patient. That day, the lowest number I had processed was 845. Patient 845 abutted the most recent defunct file of 833. As expected, the active files were segregated from the storage ones. That confirmed it. Patient 209 lacked any recorded file. The lady bookkeeper saw me gazing and mumbling my theories as I scanned for any shred of evidence for 209's file. She asked what I searched for, and I told her. She told me Chief Examiner Landis, the warden, takes care of him personally. In the 13 years that she has worked here, she has yet to see a scrap of 209's paperwork cross her desk. I dare say I do not quite trust that testimony. If my own deductions on patient 209's age are anything close to accurate, he could not have been here more than 8 years at the absolute most. Children are not sent to respite sanitarium. And why would the warden handle him personally? Is his case that severe? I should think not. Again, I am only left with questions. Questions that somehow feel dangerous to be asked. I know not the source of this danger, but it distresses me. Friday, June 17th. Weather. Sunny. Over the last several days, I have conducted my own private experiments regarding a certain observation I have made. Each morning in the daily routines of the system here, I have been tasked with wheeling the less abled patients out to the green before returning to the others still finishing their breakfast, gradually shepherding all of the ill people respite provides for out to the green. There they enjoy their leisure time in between meals, rehabilitation, and meetings with their doctors. Given that everyone makes their way onto the green at some point, save for some select staff like the bookkeepers, it is no surprise that this is where I consistently see patient 209, who always greets me with a tired smile. I met his gaze the first several days with familiarity and appreciation, but gradually with more and more suspicion. He can see it, too. I think it is the only reason he greets me specifically when he seems to know everyone. His eyes gleam with a hint of trickery, as if he knows he's allured my attention, and he likes it. On Monday, I emerged the earliest I had ever arrived on the green. The clock in the tower showed 7:15 a.m. Margaret demanded to catch as many of the early rays as possible. I walked with her, keeping the old bat company, grateful for the excuse to get up and stretch. The halls in the green were quite empty upon our approach, and Margaret sat on the edge of the green, gazing out at the vast rocky shoals and the rising sun over the Atlantic. Once I was sure that she was comfortable, and more importantly, ascertained that the attendants, clad in their white uniforms, had taken their station, I made my exit, needing to bring out the rest of my patients. My gaze lazily fell across the green, appreciating Reginald's handiwork. To my surprise, seated at a table in the green was patient 209. I had not been looking for him when we arrived, but I was almost certain nobody had entered since we entered. Had he snuck in without an attendant or assistant, such as myself? He tipped his head towards me and smiled. That tormenting glance drove more anguish into my soul, that he can be so pleasant when I so perplexed. Thus began my experiment. Each morning this week, I have endeavored to see patient 209 enter the green. By this, I can hope to find someone who knows something about him without shaking the apple cart all the way up to the warden. Tuesday, I arrived at the green no later than 7 a.m. sharp, hoping to catch how he happened to slip in the day prior. I was wheeling a debilitated patient, the kind that hardly seems to have a care of what's going on the excuse that some fresh air might help them eat more than the usual handful of oatmeal. Much to my disappointment, patient 209 was acutely seated on a bench, reading a thick, tattered manuscript. While he didn't look up, he smiled at my passing and nodded. How infuriating. Wednesday and yesterday were much the same, backing up each day by 15 minutes to 6:45, then to 6:30. I wheeled a different patient out in the early summer breeze to see patient 209 already there. He always held in his hands some stationery, his pen never far, either solving some puzzle, writing some letter, or annotating a manuscript. Always active, so unlike the other patients. Never anyone more than the morning crew of bleached shirt attendants. No sign of any other worker or any other patient for that matter. Today I attempted probably my most irrational attempt, but sometimes these things must be done for the sake of scientific results. I arrived on the green at 5:30 a.m. I slept terribly last night and awoke before dawn with a start from a terrible nightmare. Breakfast had even yet to be served and the air was still. The only people roused across the entirety of respite were the cooks in the night watch, just about to finish their tenure at dawn. One of them looked at me funny as I strode onto the green, but I gave him a weak smile, saying I just required some comforting fresh air. Whatever minor goodwill I had generated along the way vanished the instant I climbed into the array of short hedges making up the edge of the green. Seated daintily at the bench directly to my right was patient 209. He had no puzzle, no text, not even his pen with him. He simply sat gazing across the waves, contemplating the sunrise. I was beaten. I sat down beside the man, rubbing the sand from my eyes. 209 did not move, and I can understand why. The peaceful tranquility of a morning dawn is wondrous, and the color today was so splendid. Its orange and pink sun-dappled rays broke through the dark veil around it, revealing its warmth and prosperity to the world. Patient 209 spoke so suddenly I nearly jumped. He said, "I'm growing concerned for you, Mr. Theodore. You've only completed your second week here, and already you're running yourself ragged." He turned towards me, smiling kindly. "I find taking in the sunrise every morning helps me find my strength. Would you join me again tomorrow? I feel it would do both of us much good." I nodded wearily, understanding how much of an anxious wreck I must look. The look is accurate, though, as I internally feel so silly for fretting about one man, so I must speak to Dr. Lawrence tomorrow, and either receive answers to my questions or lay them aside for my better health. Saturday, June 18th. Weather: cloudy. The knots in my stomach have settled, at least for the time being. Around midday, I went to see Dr. Lawrence, as per usual. Today was our agreed-upon date to compare notes, so my presence was not disruptive, although from the moment I entered, I began sweating profusely. My hands were shaking, my palms sweaty. Nothing escapes the doctor's keen eye, and he offered concerns for my well-being. "Teddy, my boy, you look dreadful," he said. "Were you not in uniform, I dare say I couldn't tell you from a patient. Tell me at once, what is the matter?" It all fell in a deluge, the questions I had sat on, the ever-rising mountain of curiosities about patient 209. From the moment I mentioned his name, the tension and fear dropped from his face, and Dr. Lawrence smiled at me sadly. "I told you not to pay him any mind, son." He sat and heard my waterfall of questions, nodding along as I babbled like an undisciplined child. When I finally ran out of air, I slumped into a chair, exhausted. Dr. Lawrence's face was pensive. The silence lingered in the air for a moment too long. The doctor was calculating something behind his brow. Then he spoke. "Teddy, I dare say nobody at respite in quite some time has thought so ardently about the machinations of one person." He straightened up in his chair. "Patient 209, as he has been labeled, is a unique case that even I know not the full details of. Landis handles him through and through, does the analysis process himself and everything. Now," he thumbed open one of my patient reports, "you have made exemplary calculations and observations on all my patients in the few short weeks you have had to work with them. Astuteness will take you far in the field of psychoanalytics. Freud would be proud. I did not expect such a compliment. I stammered a statement of appreciation, which the doctor waved aside. Dr. Lawrence stood and began to pace gently, hands behind his back. Something the Respite Committee, myself, the other doctors, and of course Chief Examiner Landis, we have had a debate on our hands ever since the new batch of assistants arrived. Patient 209 is attended to with special, he searched for the right word, attention. My eyebrows raised, giving away my immediate interest. As our longest patient, his rehabilitation is a primary concern. So, he placed his hands on the table and leaned forward. I believe I will be recommending you for this position. I must have had some ridiculous expression on my face, a mixture of shock and awe, for he smiled. Dr. Lawrence slowly retook his seat, not waiting for an answer. You will still have to work with me and my patients. However, my hope is that by increasing your proximity to the enigmatic man, you will allow your health to take center stage. Are we clear? I nodded profusely. Good. That'll be all. Monday, June 20th. Weather, sunny. I spent the weekend wrapped in anticipation. Yesterday I received formal confirmation at dinner that I would be doing one-on-one psychoanalytic therapy with patient 209. Dr. Lawrence gave me the news over dinner. Reginald fails to understand my enthusiasm about studying one man so closely, but he is not a scientist and must be forgiven. All the gentle kindness and bedside manner that can be learned from the other patients pales in comparison to what I believe can be gained out of this single case study. The warden even approached me at breakfast today. While it was rare to see him out of his tower, I genuinely believe this is the first I've seen him in person. It was even more thrilling when he directly approached me. I presumed he had some file to give me regarding the patient. Quickly I discovered quite the opposite. The barrel-chested man smoothed down his mustache and told me my first test, as it were, was to discover as much as I could about the man's condition without any previous knowledge. Given the degree of care Dr. Lawrence had described patient 209's situation, I was taken aback by the way Chief Landis seemed to treat this as more of a game than mental sickness. He assured me 209 was not prone to volatile actions, and that the first few weeks would be mostly filled with introductory conversation. The patient must adapt to you, and vice versa, he said. Though his face chuckled with gaiety, I sensed sternness in his eyes. I vowed not to let him down. One of the attendants led me through the maniac ward, a twisting labyrinth filled with horrendous laughter, which must be the source of the terrible wailings I fall asleep to each night. As we climbed higher and higher, we transitioned from barred cells to padded ones, the walls becoming closed and the rooms expanding in size. Some of the people, though I barely used the word, looked as though they had not seen the green in their entire stay here, the true criminal prison of Respite Sanitarium. At the top floor, the attendant stopped. He opened the thick door, which swung with much less drama than most of the old doors here, and announced inside that he had a guest. As I passed him, he whispered that he'd be right outside if I needed him, and then closed the silent door behind me. I am not sure what I expected of the place patient 209 calls home. Judging simply by the approach, I had gauged that somehow the man found himself in a straitjacket each day, unfurled for public appearances down in the green each morning, and then laced back up. My mind created a fiction where he would be strapped to a dolly and wheeled around, a garish mask concealing his face as the madness slipped behind his eyes, his tongue gnashing horribly. What I saw, well, it wasn't that. Behind the door was indeed mostly a padded room. The carpet had been removed, leaving only cold stone, though I felt grateful at first, since that flooring is so terrible to navigate. The room was longer than I suspected, perhaps the length of 2 cells, and positioned in the back corner was a small wrought iron bed so typical of prisoners. His toilet pipe and sink were also as expected. Taking up space between, though, was furniture. Beside the bed stood a tall bookcase, every inch of it filled with thick volumes and folders of puzzles and paper games. A wooden table sat in the middle of the room, 2 chairs on either end of it. It was at this table where patient 209 sat. He didn't look up when I was introduced, nor during the few seconds whilst I gained an appreciation for his living quarters. 209 gave me his usual smile, and I waited politely for him to finish the paragraph. He set the book down, bringing his gaze at long last to meet mine. You certainly kept me waiting, he said with a smile. You were expecting me? Entirely. I smiled. I strode forward, setting my notepad on the table and taking a seat. We sat for a few moments in silence as I collected my thoughts. having found, lost, found again, and lost again where I wished to begin. He broke the silence first. Landis didn't give you anything, did he? I laughed and shook my head. 209 returned the laugh, and the tension evaporated. He held up a finger and stood up, taking his book over to the bookshelf. As he shelved it, his other hand grasped a small wooden box on the lower level. The patient waltzed back to the table, box in hand, and I swear I heard a faint humming from under his breath. He set down the box cautiously before dramatically revealing its contents. A chessboard. "Shall you play black or white, Mr. Theodore?" he said with boyish giddiness. We played 3 games, all of which he won. Twice I played black and once white, and each time he came up with a thoroughly considered yet easily implemented strategy that brought me down. Our dialogue moved away from small talk quite quickly. We discussed our various common associates, both patients and doctors. I was impressed by his caring knowledge of every single patient. What truly surprised me, though, was his encyclopedic knowledge of the staff. Somehow he knew Dr. Lawrence's age, a fact kept hidden even from me. Though I suppose on reflection he very well could have been bluffing, but his confidence was very convincing. After the conclusion of the 3rd game, patient 209 stretched in his chair, slowly, with the grace of a demure alley cat. He gestured towards his window, which bestowed a fantastical view of the entire south side of Respite from a dizzying height. "Mr. Theodore, I do believe if you stay any longer, you will miss dinner." I could have sworn I had only been here an hour, but judging by the ochre colors coming in, he could not have been wrong. I thanked him for the game, standing up and grabbing my blank notepad. I stifled a laugh at it, and with an apologetic look, 209 said, "You needn't worry. We'll have plenty of time to talk seriously on Wednesday." I told him it was a pleasure, and that I would see him tomorrow morning at sunrise. Sunday, July 3rd. Weather, rainy. The tide around the island was rampant tonight. The waves crashed over the stones in a way that threatened to reach up into my dormitory, slamming me down across the harsh crags below. Only late into the night did sleep finally take me. It was the first morning I didn't meet 209 at sunrise in over 3 weeks. My morning felt vacant, as if something had hollowed out my time. I suppose it was the breaking of routine. I'll try not to let it bother me too much. The rain, and consequently the time relegated inside the facility, actually lent itself to quite a bit of free time. Reginald and I congregated in the leisure room, as he had challenged my honor once again in a game of pool. Between games, I had taken to discussing yesterday's games of chess with 209, how we'd conversed for hours on the subjects of art and intellect. He was chalking the tip of his cue for our second game when he interrupted me. "How long have you known this guy, Teddy?" I was startled. Reginald usually had such pristine conversational politeness. Then I paused, having to think a second to answer honestly. "About a month, I suppose. As long as we've been here." He smacked the cue ball. "Yep, about to be a full month in a couple of days. You got any hobbies, friend?" Again, I stammered. "Well, I enjoy our time together, and the private conversations with Dr. Lawrence, and with 209. "Yes, what of it?" I hooked the 3-ball into the corner pocket. "Nice shot," Reginald said. "I mean, you brought him up just now, apropos of nothing." He takes a failed shot at the 11-ball. "So, it's fascinating research. He's on my mind." "That's just it, Teddy. Seems to me like he's always on your mind. You brought him up even on days when you haven't seen him, which, to clarify, covers just about every single day. I get being enthralled by your studies, but don't you want to talk about something else? Are none of your other patients this interesting?" Anger flared up within me. In a second, though, I knew I was only this peeved because, after all, he was right. The dominance patient 209 held in the foreground of my mind had only furthered. My longing for answers to whom he was had grown and blossomed. It seemed to be my sole fixation, my hobby, as Reginald tactfully put it. I sighed. "Sorry, Reggie." I leaned over the table, lining up a shot with the 5-ball. "To answer your question, no. The others combined aren't half as interesting as 209. He's just such an anomaly. The only person sane in a nest of mental cases, practically given the penthouse with special privileges, walking around virtually unescorted at all times. I guess I'm happy I see him every day, but Landis has been unrelenting in telling me anything. He just nods at my weekly reports, and without any dialogue, he sends me away. That's the warden for you, stubborn unless he decides not to be." Reggie grabbed my shoulder, and I turned to look him in the eye. He gave me his gentle, rural smile. "I didn't mean to make you mad. Just wanted to make sure you could hold a conversation about something else for a change." I returned his smile. He lined up a ricochet shot for the 15-ball that went wild. I rubbed my temples, trying to etch out the weariness sneaking in. "Maybe I've just had one too many late nights. I think the month has started to wear on me." Let's hope not, he says as I sink the one ball. We've still got the rest of the year before our contracts are over. He watched me in silence for a second, my mind preoccupied with the two ball. Hey, you ever asked the kid what his name is? I chuckled and passed the cue. Yeah, I brought it up last week. It occurred to me that I'd been so happy just to speak freely with him that I still didn't know his name. 209 just feels so natural. Reginald tested a few angles, frustrated at my devious setup. He tried a desperate shot and scratched the 8-ball. The groundskeeper swore under his breath and leaned profligate over the table in defeat. He swung his head towards me. So, what is it? What's his name? I still don't know. When I asked, he wagered a chess game against it. He had me in checkmate by turn 10. Wednesday, August 17th. Weather. Windy. My hands are still shaking after tonight. I will do my best to catalog my emotions into words, although I cannot deny how little they shall capture my true feelings. I'm not even sure where to begin. I was having another session with my dear patient 209, in his quarters as always. He and I were on our 6th game of chess, the first few going quite quickly. Either he was on his A game or my mind was elsewhere, so I insisted we continue to play. It got so late that I instructed the guard to fetch our dinners. With 209's consent, we supped together in his chateau, watching the brilliant sunset between the bars of his lofty window. We continued to move the pieces in between bites. My mind was much more on the chess game, so we finished dining and would sit back in his chair, observant, contemplative, that smile never leaving his face for an instant. I've quite enjoyed your company, Mr. Theodore. It came from silence. Nothing had prompted him to say anything at all, nonetheless something so sentimental. My hand was in the middle of reaching out to move my bishop when it froze midair. Something about it was indescribably abrupt. I looked up at patient 209. We stared at each other for a few tense seconds before I nervously laughed. My friend, I didn't take you for the sentimentalist. I went back to my chess piece, hoping to move the conversation away from this strange place. 209 rose and walked over to the window, now dark in the faded evening. He turned on a lamp by his bedside, the light yellow and burnt. When he turned back to the window, I could see his face was cloudy, his smile a faint, almost false veil on his face. Do you know how many caretakers they've assigned me? My eyes fluttered down to my notepad. 18, he said, not waiting for a reply. You are number 18. They each have a certain energy about them, like they know exactly what they want from me. I give it to them, and they are never satisfied, always coming back for more. Somewhere along the way they give out. Ambition can only go so far, Mr. Theodore, and even the sun will cease its glimmer one day. Do you know where the previous 17 are? 209 motioned towards the door. They are down there, somewhere else in respite, cracked and turned away from what drove them, turning instead to madness. They were so fixated on their goals, they forgot how to return from whence they came. He turned back to me, his eyes blanketing his smile in sadness. I know you seek answers, Mr. Theodore. It is your curiosity that drives you so. So please, for both our sakes, ask the question that I know you've held since the moment we met, and I swear I will answer honestly. Please, I do not wish for you to follow the same road as them. A few palpable seconds passed between the two of us. In the span of a few minutes, it felt like I aged a lifetime, my hair turning gray and falling away before growing again in youth, an eternity. Why are you here? I asked. Why do they keep you in respite? Patient 209 placed his hands on the back of his chair, nodding knowingly. Were I to tell you, I would fear that our relationship would change dramatically. You must promise the truth shall not cloud your scientific judgment. I smiled and nodded, picking up my pen and turning to a blank page in the pad. He took his seat and moved his queen into a spot that placed me in check. Because I have lived here long before Respite Sanitarium was ever conceived. I turned my head in inquisition, unsure whether or not this was another of his elaborate jokes, but the smile had fallen from his face. Patient 209 was serious. I existed in a colony of many, hidden beneath the rock structures in a space unlike water or air or ground, a location of pure space, where nothing and everything exist in tandem. In our gateway we watched humanity rise from its primordial womb, spread its wings into skyscrapers with complete fascination. Our gateways opened across this planet, many others too, but this was the only one of prospect in centuries of stillness. Many have left the gates, returning with stories of melded constructs, seeing how the ways of your world perceive things so simply. I came to the island that would hold a respite sanitarium centuries ago. Just waiting. The smile came back into his face. But I believe all that waiting has finally paid off. He paused, looking at me, my unmoving pen, as he studied every twitch of facial movement. Finally, I asked the obvious question. What were you waiting for? You. 209 said it so plainly that I had to force myself not to reel with shock. I have waited for someone of exemplary wit, that remained untainted by the cruel, sagacious nature that almost unanimously befalls the veteran scholars of this world. He gestured to the chessboard. Someone of equal peer at your own games, but who is open to ideas of indescribable beauty and grandeur. Have you never once questioned the limitations your world places upon you, of why you would want to do the simple and mundane tasks, a feeling of higher purpose, especially since, coming here, I can feel it in you, Mr. Theodore, the glorious spiritual calling of change. That is why, 209 said, smiling, I have enjoyed your company. For that, I thank you. Joy had left my face, and I now stared deep into those oceanic eyes of his, unsure of how deep I wished to read, lest I be unable to resurface. I cleared my throat politely, breaking eye contact as I prepared my professional retort, fairly certain of what I had to say and do. For a second, my dear patient, I had forgotten where I was. I scribbled a note on my pad for the warden. You see, delirium is not uncommon amongst those trapped in extreme isolation for long periods of time. Perhaps if you consider yourself a citizen of respite, there is hope for you yet. I assure you, Mr. Theodore, 209 calmly interjected, everything I've said is quite scientifically provable. A playful smile ticked at the edge of my face, cracking the facade of my professional persona. How so? Simple. I show you the gateway. I raised an eyebrow. It's beneath the farthest basement, but there is a passageway. The route is hidden behind several false walls and locked doors. I've made it deliberately hard to find, but certainly reachable. Were you to take me now, I could have us there in 15 minutes' time. You would have your proof. For a brief moment a thought pressed at my mind. The thought permits him my further inquisition, to take on his challenge and follow him down to this so-called secret entrance into another world, or whatever his brain had fabricated it to be. But then rationality cut back in. Dr. Lawrence had prepared me for this, as had all my teachers on the mainland. The ability to be firm, even with our most amiable of patients. As much as it seems Chief Landis has permitted you special treatment, I said, gesturing to the furniture in the room, I'm afraid walking the grounds at night in places off limits even to me is not something I, as your attendant, could abide. Patient 209 simply shook his head and sighed, the smile not flinching even for a second. Now, I said, rising from the well-worn wooden seat, I believe some rest will greatly benefit the both of us. Now we have plenty to work on tomorrow. I collected my writings and strode with confidence towards the door. It is these last words which leave me so unsettled about the entire evening. As I knocked for the guard, patient 209 said, I knew you were different from the previous ones, Mr. Theodore. See you at sunrise. We locked eyes for a moment. That placid smile of his bored a hole in my memory. Sunday, August 21st. Weather, rainy. My thoughts are troubled. I went to see Chief Examiner Landis today in an attempt to quell the turmoil and ever-burgeoning questions in my head. I gave him a full report, including everything that it seemed the patient said in confidence, not having any stable footing on where our relationship may be. I have not joined him for sunrise since last Wednesday, nor do I plan to anytime soon. The warden sat patiently through my entire account of what happened. His mustache bristled at a few points, which is more emotion than I usually receive. In the end, he snorted a chuckle to himself and wrote something down. It seems he has yet to improve, he said in his deep baritone voice. Pardon, sir? Landis straightened up. What he told you about 17 previous attendants is true. Each of them have reported to me the same story that you have now, or some variation thereof. I believe he changes the wording gradually, a way to keep the story interesting. Not to you, to him. Total madness, eh, Theodore? He laughed more openly now, and I found myself relaxing considerably as I joined him. Holes in the world? What a load of hogwash. If I had told you from the beginning, you never would have believed me, would you? When the laughter died down, from both of us, but mostly the chief, I dared to inquire, What about the other thing he said, regarding his other attendants becoming patients? The smile fell from Landis's face in an instant. I am not at liberty to discuss previous employees of Respite Sanitarium, legal disclosure and all that. He made a waving motion with his hand as if to brush it under the rug, but I could read the facts. They were chilling. A single morsel of truth. If a part of the story is true, why not the whole? Monday, September 12th. Weather, rainy. For the last 3 weeks, I have not slept well. At night, I find myself tossing and turning, as though on a ship of the last century, making a long journey across a tumultuous and hurricane-riddled sea. I've vomited on more than one occasion, and my waking thereafter has not been pleasant. I was not built to combat such a degree of grogginess. My simple daily routine, which I depended upon for the months preceding my confrontation with patient 209, have all fallen away. I no longer greet him at the waking sun every morning, although judging by his continued stalwart station on the green, it seems this disturbance has had no effect on him. Every day as I wheel out the curable patients, not stricken so thoroughly to the core of their being with madness and delusion, he still smiles and acknowledges me with a nod or a glance. We are back to playing a game, and it only makes me very angry. On several occasions when I go to meet him, our chess matches now typically only have one uneventful and silent game. As I attempt to make professional headway into his psyche, he sends my logic around in circles. I do not delve into his lunatic fantasy of other worlds. Such treatment only confirms an addled mind that such things exist. I attempt to gear the conversation towards only what is logical and what can be explained scientifically. Then he will find some lawyerly loophole and take the entire train off course. Such is the curse of the intelligently infirmed, too dumb to realize how tragic their fall has been, yet too confident to accept the necessary aid. His eyes smile truly, yet I feel there is a darkness, a deep cynicism, which laughs behind them. Tuesday, September 27th. Weather, rainy. Reginald broke the pool balls. "You look horrible today." I merely grunted in affirmation from my place, slumped against the wall. Outside, through the small, clouded windows, towards the ceiling of this quasi-cellar, I watched the rain coming down in torrents. Patches of mud crusted the windows from the outside, making the dim, patchy light bulbs flicker eerily, a deficit of the building being made before the dawn of electricity. I wordlessly took the pool cue from him and began to aim, stripes this time, just to keep him on his toes. "I mean," he continued, "the last month hasn't exactly seen you as the handsomest man in the world, but this is ridiculous." The cue ball goes right into the hole. "Plus, you're no fun competition anymore. Turns out I hate winning when it doesn't feel like I earned it. What gives, Teddy?" We were alone in the room that day. Dr. Lawrence needed to manage some confidential paperwork and send me away. Reginald had wrapped up early, so we were alone. "Patient-client confidentiality," I mumbled, passing him the cue. I tried to rub illusory sand from my eye. "Come on, Teddy." Reginald stood immobile, blocking the game with his insistence. I slumped back against the wall and crossed my arms, letting my head drop. I almost felt the grip of sleep take me where I stood before Reginald grabbed me by my shoulders, jolting me awake. "We've got 3 months left, man. Don't slip on me now." The urgency left his voice and his grip softened. "What's wrong?" "If it's plaguing me this poorly, I dare not poison you." "Bullshit. You know I can take it. Don't die, stubborn Teddy." I sighed. My hand made a motion for him to sit at the edge of the pool table. Once he got comfortable, I, in hushed tones just in case, proceeded to tell him about that single encounter with patient 209. How his delusional fantasy, while still solidly in the realm of fiction, did not discount the fact that he was right about so many things. Not to mention his countenance, how solemnly he stood as a sane figure at respite, and how such clever eyes could concoct such madness. When I told him the warden all but confirmed 209's point that all the previous attendants had to be mentally hospitalized, Reginald made a hurtful but not inaccurate jab at my own health, but otherwise absorbed the tale in rapt silence. I felt a certain pain leave my body as I spilled this turmoil, all of my discomfort and agony having festered internally under Landis's unhelpful commentary and patient 209's constant, unsettling smile. When I finished, I made no grand conclusory statement. I simply ran out of words. Reginald blinked a couple times. "That's it?" he asked. I nodded. The man sat and pondered for a moment, hand on chin, scratching occasionally. Then he nodded resolutely, levied himself up from the pool table, and began walking towards the stairwell. He stopped at the doorway, and with a smirk, gestured for me to follow. "Where are you going?" I asked. "To get you some proof," he said. "Let's just say," he jingled a ring of keys, "you're lucky to have a friend in maintenance, and I want a satisfying game of pool." I smiled for the first time in weeks. We left the game unfinished on the table. We descended several stairways, crisscrossing the network of chaotic corridors and extensions that had been cobbled into the underbelly of Respite Sanitarium. On the few instances where Reginald needed guidance throughout the clinical towers, I had guided him with the ease of a parent leading their child. Now Reginald was my guide, always a stride or two ahead as we whisked down dimly lit tunnels, descending further into the unknown. I felt a sense of dread growing in my stomach, the walls growing gradually closer until each passageway felt only the width of one man. Reginald would call back to me, and I would leave my headspace, the walls instantly growing wider, and we would proceed. Eventually, the yellow phosphorescent lights faded, the wiring being too expensive to dredge into these dark areas. Reginald unlocked a room that was only illuminated by cheap red lighting, the emergency lamp dangling weakly in a corner. "This is the bottommost place I could think of," he said as we stepped in. He gestured around to the usual arrangement of broom closet armaments. Beyond the racks of buckets and shovel heads sat heavy equipment, garden shears that had been dulled and left to rust, or sections of brass pipe removed, dried, and corroding. It was larger than I thought, although the stone ceiling was quite low and bowed in places. Reginald affectionately referred to it as rock bottom. It looked as if no one had attended to the room in a matter of years. 209 talked about false walls, right? As far as I can tell, all the walls in here are made of solid, foot-thick concrete. That ease your head? I ran my hand along one of the walls, reaching over a piling of piping. It was smooth, not a crack to be found. I nodded, trying to run through every possible question in my head, knowing this would be the time to exorcise these demons. My eyes glanced across the pile towards a ceiling-length shelf in the back, its old pine shelves sparse with tools. A large mound of rope and hose sat in between it and I, obscuring it, but it felt to me as if it were the only thing off-kilter from the rest of the room. I slogged across the mud-caked pile, my disturbance filling the room with stenches of mold and growths. My pants are surely ruined, but in the moment I hardly cared. The corner of the room filled with light. I turned to see Reginald finally bringing out his flashlight. Its weak battery illuminated the area just enough to do some work. He stood back, a curious expression on his face, but I suppose he knew it'd be better to let me play it out rather than stop me. The extra light allowed me to find a handhold on the edge of the shelf. The wood bowed as I peeled it away from the concrete. A sliver of darkness eked from behind the shelf, and moving air brushed past me. Before I knew what I was doing, the shelf had slid several inches from the false wall, creating an opening. Like a rabid animal, my body was filled with adrenal strength at the possibility of satiating answers. Reginald was moving across the room to help, but already I had forged the way forward. As he approached my now panting figure, I motioned silently for him to douse his torch. He clicked it off, and it took the requisite moment for our eyes to adjust to the terrible red light again. We saw with certainty that only darkness dwells in this cavern. Reginald turned his flashlight back on, and we both slid through the entrance. While upon our descent, some of the walls and even floors had run slick with a covering of rain from above. Every inch of conceivable space was ill with wetness. We shuffled rather than stepped our way down the natural slope, the rain-slick precipice of darkness. Reginald, his torch in hand, pointed past me. Constantly sliding, I was unable to let him take the lead, yet too nervous to stop and take the torch for myself. Portions of the cave had fallen away, leading to heavily shadowed sections of sea, the ocean currents beneath respite lapping at the craggy stalagmites below. Certainly a fatal fall. After what felt like an excruciating time, due mostly in part to our laggard movement, I began to take notice of the construction of the cave. A spiral descent. The turning was not abrupt or sudden, but from our entrance we were gently being corralled towards the center of the sanitarium. The both of us breathed a sigh of great relief at a simple sight. We saw stairs. The stone that made them was like the rest of the descent, a dark black stone, slick and cold like obsidian. Despite their ominous portent, they were a welcome sight to our weary spirits. We stepped onto the first stair, and Reggie shined his light. Both of us exchanged a glance of shock. It appeared that this was the terminus of the cavern. The stairs were few, and once they ended, they fed into a small cave, completely sealed and unblemished by hole or gap. The only discernible pieces of decoration were 2 chairs and a table, each of aged wood, with the soft hint of disintegration and rot crawling up from the bottom. Reginald stood at the top of the stairs as I descended madly. His light followed me as I scrambled for any further clues, perhaps a hidden tome or some cryptic secret pattern. It was so close to fact, to science, there either had to be something confirming the story or something completely defaming it. But no! Nothing! Hours of searching only to yield the one thing respite had reliably provided for me. More questions. My friend said something regarding coincidences, how this was something akin to an archaeological discovery, but just proved that patient 209 had been here a long time and knew something the warden probably assumed nobody would find. I couldn't hear it clearly. My body had placed both hands on the table, a ringing clamoring in my ears as my brain ran on every cylinder. Without a word, I climbed the stairs and began making my way back up. The light bounced erratically behind me, and I felt a hand grab me from behind. Reginald and I both nearly collapsed on the slick ramp from the jarring motion. My hearing came back. He was shouting at me. "Hey!" he yelled. Reggie's vocals reverberating off the stony walls. "Are you listening? Where the hell is your head?" I shook my head in a vain attempt to clear it, my fatigue reaching its absolute maximum. "It's too close. Too similar." "What, you think a verified lunatic was right? About 600 people have come and gone since he was listed. Makes sense that he would know about a secret passageway. I don't know about the furniture, but what's still bothering you? There's no other world down here." I looked back at the scene at the end of the cave. At this point, Reggie, I'm not sure what I believe. Despite his words of protest, I wordlessly walked the way out of the cave. Thursday, September 29th. Weather: foggy. Our table was silent at lunch. Reginald sat across from me, taking his food in massive, bored bites, his eyes fixated on the table. I merely pecked at my meal, appetite being among the commodities I no longer held. My eyes, too, were on the table. I hadn't seen him at all yesterday, but in the time between our dreadful expedition and now, the tension my obsession had manufactured had not diminished in the slightest. A bold voice called from across the room, "Mr. Reginald, there you are!" We both turned instinctively to see the barrel-chested figure of Chief Examiner Landis making his way across the cafeteria. "I was hoping I would find you here. I read the report you submitted regarding your discovery the other day. Most auspicious." The large man smoothed his mustache. "Well intuited on your part as well, Mr. Theodore." He clapped me on the back. My head swam with questions. "It takes a strong scientific mind to discern the truth from falsity and uncover things less known, I say." "I'm terribly sorry, sir," I stammered, "but I don't have a clue what you're talking about." The old man bristled beneath his mustache. "I assumed you were informed. Mr. Reginald here submitted a full report concerning the hazardous hallway the two of you discovered on Tuesday." I glared at Reginald. "Well done disseminating the mad stories of a patient to find a secret, my boy. You have done your part making Respite Sanitarium safer." I turned back towards the warden. "Safer, sir?" "Why, yes. We shall be filling that blasted cavern by the start of next week. Can't have people stumbling down there and falling subject to a horrible fate, now can we?" My eyes went wide. The first tangible clue to uncovering this mystery, and it was about to be destroyed? Impossible! I could only look up to Landis in horror, my lips quivering as I politely lied. "Yes, sir. Very good." The warden clapped us both on the back. "I'll have to see the two of you commended for your hard work. Keep this up and I'll have a healthy recommendation for you both when this is all over." Reginald smiled at him and thanked him graciously. It took all of my effort not to leap across the table and obliterate him. With a "carry on," Chief Landis strutted away. Reginald and I locked eyes. He cleared his throat. "It'll be out of sight and out of mind before long, you know," he said, tentative but caring. "Soon you'll have nothing to worry about." "I suppose you're right," I said, carrying as much cold as the approaching winter would allow. He started to say something else, but I rose in the middle of a sentence, collected my plate, and left. Later today I was called into Dr. Lawrence's office. I expected as much, since the day before I had been so ill that I hadn't been able to attend to our patients for the first time since my arrival. The nausea and exhaustion were great, but my turbulent brain was the paramount reason for my incapacitation. I put on my best professional face and made my way to the office. The calm doctor bade me enter the moment I knocked. In the past, he usually required something to steady his idle hands, the brush of paperwork or the organization of a file. Today, his desk was clear. His hands were folded on top of the polished surface, patiently waiting. A sense of dread instantly overcame me. "Mr. Theodore, how are you?" he asked as I sat down. "It's been a few days, and did you always have such large bags under your eyes?" I shifted uncomfortably. "I haven't been sleeping very well, sir." "You certainly look the part. The physician that inspected you yesterday said you couldn't even rise to eat and barely to use the bathroom." "It's been like this for over a month now, sir. I don't think my body can take much more." The doctor smiled gently. "This isn't completely out of the ordinary. About halfway through a person's tenure at Respite is when we see the most illnesses and staff fatigue." I nodded, not doubting Dr. Lawrence's long experience that far outweighs my own. "Now, before you began working in part under Chief Examiner Landis, we spoke briefly about your minor obsessions with uncovering answers. While I know it is not my place to pry, has your time with patient 209 continued to fault your steadfast mind?" I paused a second in answering, but in that second Dr. Lawrence had his answer. He smiled softly, leaning back in his creaky old chair. "I see." A hand reflexively massaged the back of his neck. "Well, He straightened up. I believe I made it quite clear that your servicing patient 209 would be contingent on the fact that you make your health your top priority over your quest for answers. My eyes widened as I followed his logic trail, a hand at my side shaking uncontrollably with fear and rage. Since your health has deteriorated far beyond the level it was at that point, I'm afraid I will have to revoke your privilege to see patient 209, effective immediately. No! My voice moved without warning, not giving me a second to contain it. Dr. Lawrence looked at me in a shock similar to my own, the two of us appalled at this unexpected outburst. Furthermore, the doctor pressed, spite beginning to sneak into his voice, if I so much as see you speak to the man on the green, you'll be packing out of here and far from your precious answers before you can bat an eye. Am I clear, Mr. Theodore? I controlled my voice this time, but didn't trust it. I nodded solemnly. His expression softened. You realize this is for your own good, yes? In you I have seen potential that rivals any doctor I have seen ever to come into respite or any other establishment. This is killing you, Mr. Theodore, and you're no use to anyone dead. I heard him, but the words weren't processing. My mind was in pandemonium. All that I had worked to further this mystery, to find the fine line between fact and fiction regarding patient 209, had been torn asunder in a matter of hours. And, Dr. Lawrence added after a brief pause, should your health return, I would be more than happy to allow you to see patient 209 once more. Consider this a temporary lightening of duties. Your health is my priority, Mr. Theodore. It should be yours as well. I nodded in acceptance, my lips a grim but formal frown, pressed so tightly the thin line threatened to disappear off my face entirely. Well then, take the day to reflect. I'll see you tomorrow morning. Be well, Mr. Theodore. Friday, September 30th. Weather, foggy. I have made all the preparations for tomorrow night. I simply pray for guidance, that I not falter at the time of action. Saturday, October 1st. Weather, foggy, rainy. I will attempt to record everything that has happened with the utmost speed. Let this living testimony stand as a record of what has occurred today, the ultimate transaction of scientific inquiry. It began at lunch. I approached Reginald, who was seated alone, the vast majority of staff and patients having filtered out. I knew I would be acceptably late to my afternoon patient with Dr. Lawrence, but it had to wait. My tray was full with food. As I sat down, my friend lifted his gaze to see me. He picked his head up from the morose lean it was affixed in, blinking as he looked into my face. Well now, that's a prize-winning smile if I ever saw one. What's got you so happy? I smiled warmly. Perhaps after being given some time to rest, I have come to accept the help of a friend. So, you got everything in your head sorted out? He smiled hesitantly. I flashed some teeth for emphasis. Never been better. Reginald straightened up, scooting in his chair. Well then, why don't you thank me with a pool tournament? And maybe throw a few matches if you really want to make it interesting. I shook my head. Dr. Lawrence needs me back in the fray. Turns out I've been neglecting a great deal of my work. However, I placed one of the full paper cups from my tray in front of him. I did snag some celebratory hot chocolates. Now we're talking. Reginald grabbed the cup with enthusiasm. He held it up to toast, and I grabbed mine respectfully. To our wisdom and friendship, may they stand the tests of time. We said our cheers, taking hearty drinks from our cups. I wolfed down my lunch shortly thereafter, and quickly excused myself. I found Reginald again just as the sun was going down. He was walking away from the green. Limping is more the appropriate word, his haggard form tastefully out of sight of the last patients trickling out for the day. I had kept a watchful eye on him, and when I approached him, his speech was slurred and slovenly. Had I no knowledge of his state, I'd think he was drunk. Teddy, what you doing here? He slurred. I guess to work in a few... Nonsense, Reggie. I insist you come with me to the medical ward. But okay. I took him back to his quarters, told the guards on the outside he was coming down with a fever and the nurses had sent him to bed for the night shift. They nodded and showed me to his room. I undressed him down to his boxers like a fussy parent. Then I exited the room, nodding to the guards on my way out. A few hours after the sun had dipped below the horizon, I found myself walking a very familiar route in the upper wards. The passageways thinned as I reached the peak levels of Respite Sanitarium. As the thin drizzle began to steadily pour outside, the freaks began to come out in full force, like the contagious crying of infants. Once one cries, they all must cry. I walked down the last hall, accompanied by a symphony of laughter and screams. The hall at the door was already on full alert, but his attention was aimed in the perfectly wrong direction. Patient 209 sat at his usual seat at the table, a thick text underneath his fingers. When the door opened, he did not look up, but extended a finger to request patience. Presumably, he found a good stopping point and closed the book, looking up to see me standing in the doorway, a weight of brass pipe in my hand. Ignoring the small blood stain on the instrument, he looked me in the eyes and smiled. "You took longer than expected." We set off, taking the less used stairways. Exiting the top floor was easy, setting the guard in 209's cell and walking with confidence through the madhouse around us. 209 followed closely behind, his stride set evenly with mine, not so close to display fear, but not so far back as to indicate nonchalance. He crossed the surface and continued lower, plummeting down further. I followed the meticulously memorized sequence down towards rock bottom. Having already walked it twice both ways, I had no fear in my heart. The closet came into view, and I produced Reginald's keyring, careful to lock it behind me before I opened the door once again. The two of us crossed the threshold. Reginald and I had replaced the shelf after our re-entrance, so the opening would need to be remade. I gently set the pipe behind its brethren, having promised not to take it for very long. Patient 209 stepped onto the pile of ropes, heading towards the shelf with the speed that only memory can provide. We had found the right way. I knew it! I heard the patient exhale, bringing his right hand across his body. As he did so, my vision of the shelf became obscured. It looked as if, by some sort of magnification, the image of the shelf bowed outwards, perhaps as if it were in some kind of bubble. I blinked, and the shelf came back into focus, although it was not where it had been. With a mere wave of his hand, Patient 209 had inserted the shelf halfway into the solid concrete wall. The shelf was still completely whole, and I wonder if the other half of it was visible from the outside. Our descent was much more rapid than the previous night. Patient 209 strode forward with absolute confidence, his thinly shoed feet gliding across the slick stone as though he were an expert skier on the Alps. At one point, when near an opening in the crags, I felt myself tumbling hastily towards the gaping maw and my untimely demise. It was so real I was sure it was a fatal accident, but a moment later I was back on the slope. That was the only time in our descent that Patient 209 turned to look back at me. In the moment I believed it was my brain beginning to burgeon to weariness. Upon reflection, I know the truth. In less than a quarter of the tortuous time Reginald and I had fallen, Patient 209 confidently stepped down the short staircase into the dark cavern. I had the flashlight at my hip, but 209 moved so fluidly without it that I didn't even bother turning it on. He was in his element. He was home. Patient 209 walked over to the table and had a seat on the far side. I crossed the threshold and sat opposite him. I did so on instinct. He produced from underneath his garments, where it had been kept quite dry and safe, the chessboard. In a minute we had the pieces arranged and began to play. The game is beyond memory. I felt my hands moving each piece, our moves in precise synchronization around each other. It was less a duel of wits and more an elegant dance, in which our fingers traced a delicate ballet, striding around each other in perfect movement. Slowly I came to realize I could see his face, despite the perfect, unbreakable darkness. Then I could see the stone reflected behind him, then the table, the chairs, my eyes kinesthetically connecting to everything in the immediate vicinity. As the pieces were exchanged, the light became brighter, and my senses even more keen. Things began to change. The stone behind him began to swirl. We began to spin, first at a slow and then to a modest velocity, the black collapsing behind him in a rainbow of fascinating colors. The yellows intermingled with the light greens and pinks, a cornucopia of beauty all at once. I could no longer hear the lapping of the waves beneath us, or the patter of rain. My ears rang with the clicking of chess pieces, a wooden serenade to the gifts of knowledge. I looked down, if look is even the appropriate word, and saw no board, no hands moving, as the rapidity of the pieces' movements grew and grew, feeling my own body move faster. I looked forward to see the face of my patient. Only his face remained, his body quickly dissolving from the limbs inward into the technicolor dreamscape around us. We locked eyes, and in that instant, he smiled. My vision filled with blinding white light. Any sensation of gravity and the natural laws of physics had failed. I was weightlessly floating. My mind had been fully unlocked. It was no longer tethered by a stubborn form which refused to take full advantage of its capabilities. I had no hands to move, no jaw to clench. I was free. Around me, the yellow light soon began to take shape. I was in the technicolor, but no form had taken me. I felt, or thought I felt, as I had nothing to feel with, a pull to my side. A creature without depiction moved past me, looked through me. It was familiar, and spoke to me not with words, but with emotion. It spoke happiness, and my spirit was overwhelmed with its word. It pulled me in a direction. I dare not say forward nor backwards, but towards others, a swimming sea of beings much the same as us. My gaze drifted away from them, not entirely under my control, but at the whim and mercy of whatever force guided this space. I saw into the technicolor swirl, saw holes, gaps, gateways that shed glimpses of the far corners of who knows where. Some were barren, others teeming with life. A few I recognized as our world, places thousands of miles away, within arm's reach. The familiar force brought me around to speak with and be spoken to by the other creatures. We spoke eagerly, and my mind filled with a whirlwind of delight. We spoke happiness again, but also loss and sorrow and wrath and fear and childish glee. A man can meditate an entire existence on what we discussed, what we felt in the span of time. Time did not exist here, or perhaps existed in a way so far removed from what we consider time that I dare not make the comparison. My presence wandered again at some point, and I found myself looking back the way I had come. There, in a glimmer, I saw the dark chamber beneath Respite Sanitarium, a small blip in the massiveness of the universe. The familiar force beckoned us back, and I fell through the Technicolor dreamscape, collapsed the colors, and felt myself take on weight again. I was sinking far beyond the confines of what I dared to dream was real, and in a fading moment I had returned to my weak form, Theodore Murdoch, once more. As the last bit of light drifted back towards darkness, I glimpsed the chessboard. Our pieces were back in the starting position, but the pieces that had started in front of the patient were now all in front of me. Then everything became dark once more. My body was heavy on its way up the slopes. The patient was reset in his room, the guard quickly taken to medical, having received an injury from a lashing-out tenant. A residential guard collected the maintenance keys and flashlight, my having found them in the halls, and I finally returned to my chambers to record everything that has transpired. I have crossed the threshold into a portion of my life that I cannot return from. To know and unlock the farthest limits of the universe, to aspire to such Elysian heights, it is miraculous in a way few can truly understand. And it is all thanks to him, that marvelous, wonderful, patient 209. Tomorrow I will make my way to his cell, and we shall speak and speak until they shut the door behind me. I dare say I will never want to leave.
This has been a Horror Obsessive original story. If you liked it, please subscribe to our channel for more, and check out our previous stories. You can also check out HorrorObsessive.com for interesting articles on horror of all kinds. And if you're interested in becoming one of our writers, please follow the link in the description below.